Hey everyone, Darwin's God here. This is going to be a very important video. I've been talking about the genetic code and its evolution, and we've seen a lot of problems with that idea. But I suspect many of you have been wondering, what would an evolutionist say to all of this criticism? That's what we're going to see in this video, and we're going to see what evolution is really all about. So I'm going to start off here with a passage from a textbook, a typical passage about the genetic code and evolution. Here goes. Okay, this is a passage in a chapter about the evidence for evolution in a popular university-level textbook. Quote, "The universality of the genetic code is important evidence that all life shares a single origin." Whoa, wait a minute. We just got done talking about how we've been looking at all of these problems with the idea of the genetic code evolving. The genetic code has been a problem for the theory of evolution. And here we see evolutionists saying something very, very different. The universality of the genetic code is important evidence that all life shares a single origin. This is quite a flip. Let's continue. For the genetic code is, quote, "similar between species, but would not be if the species had independent origins." This is interesting. Here you seem to have a very powerful argument for evolution from the genetic code. Let's go back to the previous slide just for a second. Remember, it was the universality of the genetic code was the key part, the key aspect here, the universality. Okay, let's break this argument down. The best way to look at these things is to slow down and break it down and see exactly what we're looking at step by step. Okay, step one. If the species were independently created, then they would have different genetic codes. Step two, the species share a common genetic code. Okay, it's true. Therefore, the species were not independently created. Therefore, they share a common ancestor. Therefore, evolution is true. Okay, that's the argument broken down. Is it true? How can we test it? Now remember, testing and skepticism is what it's all about in science. Remember, that's what Mr. Nelson taught you in your 7th grade science class. The scientist is always skeptical, always testing things. You don't just take it for granted. Just because you read it in some textbook about evolution, you need to test it for yourself, right? Okay, how do you test an argument? Well, if the argument is valid and if it is sound, then the conclusion is true. Now, what do we mean by those things? So in this case, the argument is certainly valid. Now, what that means is the argument does not contain any fallacies. The logic flows correctly, and the conclusion is a necessary consequence of the previous steps. You have the premise, you have some observations, you have some logical flow, and then there's no getting around it. The conclusion is a necessary consequence. If that's not the case, then the argument is not valid. There's some sort of a problem, an error, a fallacy, something's wrong. That's not the case in this argument. Let's go back to the argument. If the species were independently created, then they would have different genetic codes. The species, in fact, do share a common genetic code. Therefore, they were not independently created. Okay, all that flows. Therefore, they share a common ancestor. Yes, therefore, evolution is true. This is all good, rock-solid logic. So we can say it passes the test of validity. The argument is valid. The conclusion is a necessary consequence of the premise. Okay, all good so far. What about the question of whether or not it is sound? What does that mean, sound? What the question of soundness is, are the premises true? If the premises are true in a logical argument, then it is sound. It may not be valid, and then your conclusion would not be trustworthy. But if you're both valid and sound, then you're good to go. So we've seen that it's valid. Is it sound? Well, to answer that question, we home in and focus on the first step because that is the premise. If the species were independently created, then they would have different genetic codes. Is that true? Okay, well, let's make some observations about this. Number one, there is no scientific basis for this. Now, what do I mean by that? Anytime you hear a claim like this, ask the question, what experiment could I design? What experiment could I perform to test this? to verify it, to confirm it, to validate it, to falsify it, to kick it around. What experiment could I do to check that out? What experiment did evolutionists do that brought them to this? What experiment could anyone do to evaluate this claim? Well, there is none. There's no experiment here. This doesn't come from experimental science, or we say empirical science. This is not a claim of empirical science. So right off the bat, your kind of red flag should kind of pop up. Always ask yourself, what experiment could I do to check this out? Okay, number 2, this is a counterfactual. We've never built this kind of a world. We've never built a world or observed a world where the species have different genetic codes. We only have one world to look at. We've got one example here, and they have pretty much the same genetic code. So this is a counterfactual, which also should raise a kind of a little red flag here. How do we know this? Okay, number 3, there are many reasons for common biochemistry, including a common genetic code. For example, species share a lot of genetic information. This is called the lateral gene transfer or horizontal gene transfer. Species share this information, and it just wouldn't work if they had different genetic codes. So that's just one reason why we would expect a common genetic code across the species. It would be a little surprising if they just had different genetic codes. So here we find not only was there no scientific basis for this premise and that it's a counterfactual claim, but in fact it's not even inspired by the science that we do know. Things are getting more interesting. Number 4, what is really going on here? Well, this is actually a religious claim. It is a claim about what your god or gods would or wouldn't do regarding the genetic code. There is no way science can evaluate this. It goes against the science, and it is a claim about what a god or gods would do. Whenever you're talking about the attributes of God or what a divine intention would be or what gods would or wouldn't do, you're in the realm of religion, I think. I don't think you're any longer in science. So let's summarize what we have here in this question of the genetic code and what the evolutionists say about the genetic code. They make this sort of a claim that is not from science. It's not experimentally motivated. This is not a one-off. I'm not just digging down and finding a couple of rare examples. This is ubiquitous. It's rampant in the evolutionary literature. It is core to the theory. These are the sorts of metaphysical or religious or theological claims that drive the theory that mandated evolution in the first place. And they were around a long time before Charles Darwin got in a boat and went anywhere. Religion drives science, and it matters.